Well, hey, folks, you're not going to want to miss this episode of Cults Among Us as I return to a polygamous community that I investigated more than 20 years ago. We're going to look back at the Fundamentalist church known as the FLDS and wander around Colorado City and Hildale. I'm going to be accompanied by the former bodyguard of polygamous prophet and pedophile Warren Jeffs. Join me as I walk down this cult lane full of memories. Welcome to Profiling Evil's Season 2 podcast, Cults Among Us. As we get started, I hope you'll take a moment, hit that like and subscribe button, and ring the bell so that you receive all of our notifications on videos throughout the Profiling Evil network. Well, I'm thinking back to the latter part of the 1990s and into the year 2004. I was charged with investigating allegations of child sex abuse, underage marriage, and other ritual crimes for the state of Utah. The role came after the Utah State Legislature set aside some money to look into cases of ritual abuse, then defined more casually as satanic abuse. I had just wrapped up 2 years of court cases and follow-up in the Zion Society cult. I was hired by the Attorney General to work with a team of investigators and prosecutors to uncover the depth and breadth of the abuse and homicide claims. In all, we investigated more than 300 cases of ritualistic crime, sexual abuse, and other crimes like this across Utah and the western United States. The focus Utah placed on ritual crime wasn't novel by any means. It was all part of a global hysteria called the Satanic Panic era. Utah added an interesting twist to the hysteria and the added dynamic of bigamy and polygamy. The Satanic Panic era involved the investigation of more than 12,000 cases of satanic ritual abuse. In the end, all remained unsubstantiated, according to Wikipedia. Now, these crimes were known by different names and in different areas. They were classified like things like organized abuse, sadistic ritual abuse, and cult crimes. The rumblings of satanic panic started back in the 1980s, and by the close of the 90s, it had spread across the globe. The term satanic panic was actually created by a Canadian psychiatrist who wrote about the unreliable allegations which rose from repressed and recovered memories of people who had been abused. The allegations ranged from localized accounts of abuse to worldwide conspiracies where the rich and famous were abducting and breeding children for all forms of exploitation and sacrifice. The claims then, and still today, are controversial and negatively impacted anyone that came into contact with the cases. People like cops, politicians, religious leaders, lawyers, therapists, and social workers. The allegations of sustained ritual abuse included most closed societies, where speculation was the only transparency that was available. There was finger pointing at religious fundamentalists, police and government officials, child advocates, therapists, and clients. From the get-go, I had a problem with the term satanic abuse, and I persuaded our state to simply refer to these cases as abuse crimes, knowing we could introduce any ritualistic component during the court process. Ritual crime was something people could define, although most people immediately thought of Satanism. Rituals are a sequence of activities that involve gestures, words, actions, or objects. Serial predators are fantasy driven, and those fantasies cause them to commit crimes in a certain way, usually one step at a time. If the ritualism is removed for one reason or another, the predator is left frustrated and they're going to commit crimes again very soon. Rituals can be as benign as the repetition traditions of a group or a community out there. Take the Boy Scout organization, for instance. It recites the Scout oath and law. Well, I haven't been in scouting since my youth, but I can still recite the oath and law verbatim. This system of traditionalism and symbolism can be found in many organizations, whether they're civic, religious, public, or secret. In religions and cults, the rituals might include rites or oaths of allegiance. Just because we use the word ritual to define behaviors doesn't mean that all rituals are bad. For instance, rituals can be part of a legitimate process. Think about something like when a couple recites the legal verbiage of a wedding vow, or the swearing in ceremony where a police officer promises they're going to uphold the law. Think of your local or national politicians. They take an oath of office as they enter their term of service. Now, we can quickly go down rabbit holes when thinking about rituals or ritualistic behavior. For instance, is it your desire to fist bump or shake hands when you meet someone? And is that a ritual? How about standing to recite the nation's oath, like in the US here, our Pledge of Allegiance? In the field of psychology, the term ritual is often used to describe repetitive behaviors. Having spent much of my career looking at serial predation, this fits our discussion today most appropriately. So let's use that. In Utah, we learned that focusing on ritual crime was distracting. Instead, we chose to focus on the crimes that were printed in our law books. In other words, we focused on discovering and uncovering crimes of child abuse. If ritualistic things happened during those crimes, we waited until the sentencing phase to introduce those. That way, any argument was over something that we could all agree on, whether abusing children was right or wrong. Now, exploring the hysteria surrounding the Satanic Panic era taught me that every state in the US was caught up in this discussion. I mean, globally, there are examples that suggest it was happening abroad too. And I'll let those of you from different countries other than America weigh in on that subject of whether or not your government was concerned. And I'm going to be looking for your comments down below. But in the end, none of the estimated 12,000 plus cases of ritual abuse were ever substantiated. Again, according to research through Wikipedia, which I've found has become pretty darn accurate. Well, I haven't torn the online reports completely apart on the topic, but I can say that I really disagree with the assumption that none of the cases were substantiated. The Zion Society and today's topic, the FLDS Church, are perfect examples, evidence that it did in fact occur at some level, perhaps even higher than we might have suggested. You see, every region of the world has an example or two, or maybe more, of allegations of horrendous crimes of abuse and murder. These allegations are not only recent, but they've existed and have been reported throughout our histories. With that in mind, I want to talk about the FLDS Church, which gained global attention when its self proclaimed leader was sentenced to prison in Texas for sexually abusing young girls. In fact, I think that terminology is too mild. This guy was accused and convicted of raping children, all in the name of the God that he worshiped. I started investigating the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints more than 20 years ago. The name most used to identify this sect is FLDS, and I don't want to confuse the people in Hildale, Utah, and Colorado City with the people you've come to know as the Mormons. They are not the same church, and they certainly are not teaching the same doctrines. The FLDS members are either excommunicated Mormons, they were kicked out of the church, or they never were members of the Latter-day Saints faith. The slang term Mormon isn't used any longer, and church officials are reminding the world that their members and their church title is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And one more point of clarification here. The practice of polygamy, it was discontinued by the Latter-day Saint people more than 130 years ago. Well, I'll never forget my first trip to the Utah Arizona border towns of Hildale and Colorado City. I was in my personal vehicle, a pickup truck. I had just been assigned by General Graham to seek out and better understand Utah's polygamous communities. I decided I'd leave my unmarked police car at home, hoping that I might fit into the area a little easier. I'll never forget as I pulled into town, I stopped at a small grocery store to get a Coke. There were those unmistakable long prairie dresses. The women looked the same to me, and each had a similar hairstyle. They didn't speak to me other than a cautious nod of the head. They took my money, but I wondered if it was a normal procedure what I was feeling. I mean, I felt like it wasn't, and I would later learn that they were less than encouraged to be hospitable with people who came around. Now, within minutes of entering the community, I also noticed men in pickup trucks following me. They appeared to be using walkie talkies to communicate with each other, and I wondered at first if they were the local police department just in unmarked vehicles, some pretty beat up unmarked vehicles like cattle trucks. Well, we didn't trust the police officers in that community at that time simply because we didn't know whether they were controlled by the laws of the land or by the self proclaimed prophet of the group. I would learn many years later that it was actually the latter. I tried to shake this tell, though, as I drove around, but there were more of them than there was of me. When one truck would peel off, another would simply fall in behind. I waved a number of times at the local residents who were brave enough to stare at me as I drove by. Not one person returned the waves. I spent about 30 minutes driving up and down those streets, and the longer the men told me, the longer I committed myself to staying. Now, it was uncomfortable, I got to admit. They were clearly paranoid, and I guess I was just young enough, perhaps dumb enough, that I wanted to send a message to them that I wasn't intimidated. Over the years, I'd repeat this exercise many times, and only on those times when I happened to have my wife and or family in the car would I shorten the length of my visit. Hildale, Utah sits on the north side of the Utah-Arizona border with Colorado City on the south side. Fittingly, a street called Uzona Avenue divides the two townships, and that shares a state border. Now, near the border is a seasonal river called Short Creek. It's dry most of the year, but it fills to overflowing when the heavy rains fall or when the mountain snows are melting in the spring. When it floods, it can be disastrous. Now, on the south side of Short Creek is a little park named Cottonwood Park. I would stop there as often as I could to just check out who was there, especially if it was a holiday. The park was really quite beautiful with tall swings, bars for the children to play on, and it had some really cool old farm equipment and a hobby barn where the kids seemed to go to get arts and crafts. A small train was tucked away in a little underpass area, and when it was running, the kids would swarm it just for a chance to catch a ride. Well, during my first visit and each subsequent visit, I became acutely aware of the difference in housing for the members. The leaders of the group appeared to be living in luxurious brick and mortar homes. Many were surrounded by tall cement or brick fences that would keep out curious onlookers, like me. It would keep us from seeing inside the yards or near the houses. Then, right next door to those homes were the members of the group that were just normal folk. These homes were much smaller and often in terrible condition. The yards weren't like I would have expected either. They were full of weeds and overgrown, filled with junk in many cases. But there was one unmistakable and obvious difference. The homes weren't finished off. They still had plywood on the walls, boarded up windows or doors. And it wouldn't be until later that I would learn from locals who were not members of the FLDS, folks like sheriff's deputies or other outsiders, that the homes were left unfinished so cult members didn't have to pay taxes on them as finished dwellings. It would be 2 decades later before I'd receive another explanation of why those homes remained in disrepair, and I'll share those in a little while. Well, hey folks, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Profiling Evil Podcast, Season 2, Cults Among Us. We'll get back to this explanation of the FLDS in a moment, but I wanted to invite you to check out my book, Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. It chronicles my investigation and ultimate takedown of a religious cult that was sexually abusing children and some adults. The book explores cult behaviors, and it exposes tactics that cult leaders use to recruit and control their members. It also spotlights how some of the survivors of this cult rose above the injuries they suffered to take control of their lives. I think their victory is inspirational and admirable, and I hope that you'll pick up a copy today. And you might be interested to know that the proceeds from the book are going toward building a new children's advocacy center. So think about it. You can purchase a signed hardbound version of the book at profilingevil.com, or you can get a paperback or ebook version by visiting Amazon. Now, let's get back to our discussion on the FLDS Church and the Warren Jeffs case of abuse. Well, during my drive, I noticed there were homes that had the word Zion carved over the doorways, gateways, or in other locations around the community. I learned that this designation was a sign to other members of the community who supported the current prophet, Rulon Jeffs at the time, and his doctrine. It soon became Warren Jeffs. It served as a subtle notification where FLDS members could seek refuge or get specialized kinds of help. It reminded me of an ancient scripture that taught believers to strike blood on the 2 side posts and the upper post of a door, preventing the destroyer from entering the home. Well, this was a town filled with mystery and symbolism, a place where many eyes were watching as I moved from one end to the other. I had heard so many ghost stories of things like secret caves filled with stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. It was believable to me, frankly, because I just witnessed the same doomsday mentality in the Zion Society case. I actually took part in recovering those semi-automatic weapons from hidden locations. So why wouldn't it be true? Preparedness seemed to be a part of the culture in Hildale and Colorado City. The concept of hidden caves was really intriguing to me, but I quickly recognized there could be thousands of locations in the hills that surrounded, each with possible nooks and crannies and caves. But oh, how I wanted to know if that was true. Rumors had it again that the caves were stockpiled with explosives and food storage, all things intended to protect the leaders of the FLDS if they were attacked domestically or if they were facing the calamities of the end of the world. But one thing was clear. There was an us versus them mindset there, and I happened to be a them. I couldn't find the caves, but I did find a place called Montgomery Park, a place in the very north end of Hildale. It's a beautiful park and heavily used by members of the FLDS. A little further up the canyon were some of the most beautiful hiking trails a person could find. Now, Montgomery Park was also the meeting spot of sorts for townsfolk where they would come at the end of the day to get fresh water from a well that they believed had been sanctioned by God. For many years after that first trip, I made my way back into the polygamous community, hoping to uncover cases of child abuse, sex abuse, and welfare fraud. The Attorney General instituted a program across the state called Safe at Home. It was an absolute honor to work under General Graham and her Chief Deputy, Reed Richards. I was fortunate to be named Chief of Staff eventually in the Attorney General's office, and to this day, I acknowledge both of them for that opportunity. The hallmark of our work in the Attorney General's office was the protection of children. We added preventing family violence and tobacco reform as part of all that. General Graham authored the first child witness law in the country, and she made the act of domestic violence in the presence of a child a crime of child abuse. We used the basis of that program as a way to get closer to the leaders of the polygamous communities and our true goal, to the members themselves. The Fundamentalist Church thrived in Colorado City and Hildale for more than a century, and it's likely they would have stayed there longer if law enforcement hadn't put pressure on leaders who began looking for greener pastures. You see, by 2004, Rulon Jeffs had died. He was the prophet at the time, and his son, Warren Jeffs, took over the church. Now, Jeffs, feeling this intense pressure, purchased land in El Dorado, Texas, and began moving the leadership of the church to this 1,700-acre secluded spot of land. More than 700 people would be living there, and many more continued to find other locations to live and build the church's membership. In fact, this church was growing and spreading. The group created settlements in nearby Cedar City, Utah, Mancos, Colorado, Westcliff, Colorado, Boise City, Oklahoma, Pringle, South Dakota, Minot, North Dakota, Bountiful, British Columbia, Sonora, Baja, Mexico, Ensenada, Baja, Mexico, and again, these new headquarters in El Dorado, Texas. Well, as they moved, the church membership continued to grow, and the exact number of congregants is unknown. But I was personally told by a leader of the FLDS that it was more than 10,000 people. Moving seemed to make good sense because the Colorado City Hildale area was seated next to another breakoff group called Centennial Park. The doctrine and philosophy of Centennial Park created a schism of sorts between the people who were living and working in the same area, not to mention those who were raising children, many of whom were attending the same schools. This created a risk of intermingling, which would have been akin to the Israelites hanging out with the Hittites. Well, before we talk about recent events, let's go back and explore a little more about Hildale and Colorado City's history. The Fundamentalist Church separated from the parent church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1890, when polygamy was discontinued in the faith. The people living in Hildale and Colorado City refused to accept the revelation that polygamy should be stopped, and they broke away in protest, forming the FLDS system of belief. Anyone who continued to practice polygamy was cut off from the Latter-day Saint faith, the parent church, and removed from church membership records. Again, I want to say they are not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They are a fundamentalist breakoff group. The newly formed FLDS, or the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saint Church, became a gathering place for people who wanted to practice polygamy. But it was difficult to be allowed into this closed generational society of believers. Back in 1935, one fundamentalist named John B.O.L.O, backed by a small group of men who called themselves the Council of Friends, organized the group of polygamous believers and started the fundamentalist movement. As the group continued to meet and grow their community of like-minded believers, different beliefs and scriptural interpretations began to surface. These differences led to contentions and, again, schisms. Bit by bit, the FLDS group was becoming autonomous, and other factions were being created as groups of members left and chose doctrinal sides. Now, for those of you who have studied the different polygamy groups, this fracturing resulted in the creation of the FLDS, the Apostolic United Brethren, or AUB, and the Kingston Group, also known as the Latter-day Church of Christ. Again, I want to make it clear that none of these should be confused with the parent church. And to clarify this, those who chose polygamy were excommunicated from the faith formerly known as the Mormons. As the years rolled by, the leadership of the FLDS also changed. Succession usually followed the death of one leader, but in one case, there was a takeover before the previous leader died. In 1953, the area was raided by the government, and all of the FLDS members were arrested. 236 children were placed into protective custody, with 150 of those children not returning back to their parents for more than 2 years. In a few cases, some children were never returned to the custody of their parents. Now, this raid was known as the Short Creek Raid, and it's still a very painful topic for members of the community. As often happens, though, this type of event would be repeated later. Now, sometime after the raid on Short Creek, things returned to a level of normalcy for the group until about 1984, when another major division occurred. The leader of the FLDS in 84 was Leroy S. Johnson. Johnson had received a number of threats on his life because he was espousing a doctrine that would change the way the decisions were made inside of the group. Johnson believed God had instructed him to change the religious form of government from a body of decision makers to giving him, the leader, the sole right and responsibility of inspiration and final decision making. To counter the threat against his life, Johnson ordered men in the FLDS to become his personal bodyguards. He accepted those who stepped up to the challenge, but he handpicked one person to be in charge of him, and it was a 17-year-old kid named Willie Jessup. Jessup was sitting in school in a classroom one day when he learned that the prophet needed him at his house. He dropped everything, got up, and walked out. As he stood in front of his esteemed leader, he learned that Johnson heard through prayer that the boy was to be in charge of his safety. Well, Jessup was issued a firearm at that point, and he didn't return to school. Instead, he became the right-hand man to the prophet. Jessup would later tell me personally that he would have done anything, including commit murder, if directed by his prophet. Well, Johnson stuck to his beliefs that his God wanted a doctrine called the one-man rule, which altered the church leadership structure. In essence, it took deciding power away from a group of men and placed it solely in Johnson's hands. The men were reduced to nothing in that moment. They were furious, and soon they created a new church called the Centennial Park Group. They soon shortened that title to The Work for short. Well, when Johnson died, the man he had indicated would succeed him took over, a guy named Rulon Jeffs. Jeffs took command of the FLDS and immediately reached out to Willie Jessup, once again asking him to be his personal bodyguard. And like his prophet before, Willie was honored to serve and left a lucrative construction job he'd landed in order to do so. It was during the time that Rulon Jeffs was the FLDS leader that I became acquainted with Willie Jessup. And make no bones about it, folks, Jessup and I were not friends. We were akin to enemy combatants. I represented the government, and he perceived me as a threat to the reign of his leader. I was trying to infiltrate their close society and learn about the secrets within. Jessup was trying to feign honesty while sending me in the opposite direction every time we met. We met on a number of occasions, usually at the Hildale city offices or at the FLDS church. I never was invited to meet either with Rulon or Warren Jeffs in their secure offices. They wanted Jeffs painted as a transparent and approachable person, but Willie Jessup wasn't going to let me get close to the guy. Now, Jessup is a big guy, at least 6'3", and at the time he was muscular and broad-shouldered. He was deliberate in his verbal and nonverbal behaviors and clearly confident in his ability. Now, neither of us were dumb enough to push too hard against the other, but we made no bones about it. Our intentions were different, and we didn't like each other. Using the Attorney General's Safe at Home program as the primary motivation for coming into the polygamous communities, our intent was to open lines of communication with church members. I determined that there were two kinds of polygamous groups in Utah by then. Perhaps globally, this rings true. The first is the newly formed cults, the group of like minded individuals who establish a commune and build their membership through proselytizing efforts. These groups, in my opinion, are generally easier to infiltrate because the members have had some experience in the real world. The place where you and I live. Even if they'd been in the cult for a period of time, they still had associations and relationships outside the cult. I categorize these types of cults as convert closed societies, and I believe they are much easier to infiltrate, understand, and help people escape from if they want to. Now, groups like the FLDS, on the other hand, are much more difficult. For more than 100 years, the FLDS people have been raising families and participating in their closed society without much pollination from the outside world. The children are raised with one ideology, one way of doing things. They become the adults who then have children who are taught the same concepts, and it goes on generation after generation. Anybody who's not a member of the group is considered an outsider and not trusted. This group I call a generational closed society, and in my opinion, they are much harder, if not impossible, to penetrate. For many years, I made trips back and forth into the polygamous community, attempting to establish bonds of trust. Usually, it was after I received a tip that I hoped might prove or disprove some of these ghost stories. My hope was that we could establish ways for anyone who was being abused in those communities, though, to reach out for help. Rulon Jeffs had been leading the group since Johnson's death in 1986, and he was well established. He and Johnson had entirely different leadership styles, though, including their official title. It caused quite a stir when Rulon Jeffs announced to the church's membership that he was now their prophet, a title that his predecessor Johnson refused to use. Now, by the time the 2002 Winter Olympic Games in Utah happened, Rulon Jeffs' health was deteriorating rapidly. Those closest to him told me that Jeffs was senile and that his son Warren and the men and other leaders of the church were covering up for Jeffs, trying to keep the members from becoming too concerned. Soon, though, Warren Jeffs was appointed as the de facto leader of the FLDS, something that many members questioned because, he had only recently inserted himself back into the community and into the church's affairs. When Rulon Jeffs died that September, Warren Jeffs quickly slipped into his shoes, proclaiming that he was the new prophet of the FLDS. Well, it didn't take long after that before the state of Utah arrested Warren Jeffs for being an accomplice to rape. Jeffs' arrest opened the floodgates, so to speak, and over the months and years that followed, many more arrests were made. At first, the prophet's new bodyguard, you guessed it, Willie Jessup, was furious. He didn't believe the charges against Jeffs, and he was convinced he could prove his prophet was innocent. Well, the next card to fall in the FLDS house was a police officer named Rodney Holm. Now, he was also an FLDS member who worked under Jeff's direction and subsequently Jessup's direction. I don't know that it helps to point out that he was a church member. I mean, every member of the police force there was a member. They reported to the FLDS leadership, as did the fire chief, the grocery store manager, everybody. Nonetheless, in 2003, Holmes was convicted of unlawful sexual conduct. He was relieved of his police powers and sent to prison. In November of 2003, the FLDS Church broke ground for their new compound over in El Dorado, Texas. They called it Yearning for Zion Ranch. Again, it was a 1,700-acre ranch in a remote area, And it seemed like the perfect place for Jeffs and his church to get some peace and quiet and stay out of the view of Utah and Arizona law enforcement. Well, Jeffs was incarcerated and he began placing tough restrictions on his members, including forbidding the husbands and wives from being intimate with each other. In fact, he dissolved a number of marriages and reassigned several women to other men, according to media reports. By January of 2004, Dan Barlow, the mayor of Colorado City, and about 20 other men were excommunicated from the church, stripped of their wives and families, and sent away. Their wives and families, they were reassigned to other men. Can you believe this? Well, they were kicked out of town, and all of their possessions and all of their property was reassigned to those people Jeffs felt were worthy. In 2005, 8 male members of the church were indicted for sexual contact with minors. A short time later, a lawsuit was filed against the church and some of the members for another sexual abuse of child case. It was during this time that the 6 young adult boys that got national attention, named the Lost Boys, were expelled from the community so that the remaining women in the community could go to other men. Now, some sources say that the boys and girls in the group were rather equal in numbers. Now, think about this. If in that belief system men are to have multiple wives, then it only makes sense that you got to thin the herd so that each man can have more than one wife. I mean, hey, this is their thinking, folks, not mine. So, don't shoot the messenger. One angry former group member told me that the Lost Boys are a group of bums that should have been grown up enough to become men. He felt their story and the attention they received was ridiculous. And then he commented to me, quote, "It's the women out here that need to be taken care of. They don't know how to do anything to make it on their own," close quote. Well, holy cow, I wonder what those women would say if they heard those lips directly from his lips. Perhaps they have, I don't know. Nonetheless, it's believed that some of the boys left on their own choice, but reports suggest that some were banished simply because they were caught watching a movie or television, or they were playing football or talking to a girl without permission. Some boys were told that they could return to the commune at a later date if they brought a wife who wanted to be part of a polygamous family. Well, these so called lost boys suffered terribly when they landed in the outside world, a place that they had been taught to fear. To them, having to leave the community was a sin worse than murder, and rarely did any of them have any education that was sufficient to support themselves outside farming or other manual labor jobs. They weren't permitted to speak with their families after that, and any attempt to do so was met with resistance and shuns. Some reports suggest that the families of banished boys are told that their sons are now dead to them. And the house of cards continued to crumble when a year later, on May 7th, 2006, the FBI placed Warren Jeffs on its 10 most wanted fugitive list. The charge? Unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. I always wondered how Warren Jeffs escaped capture on that Sunday afternoon in May of 2006. He was attending a church meeting in their building in Colorado City with more than 5,000 devoted followers in attendance. Well, the answer to my question remained unanswered for more than 20 years. In that same month of May, the mayor of Colorado City was arrested for 8 fraudulent vehicle registration charges. Now, think about this. Time has kind of jumped forward a little bit. Warren Jeffs is in prison, but he's continuing to run the affairs of the church from prison. What I find interesting is that his revelations seem to eerily mirror his own environment. He demanded his bodyguard, Willie Jessups, to start looking for a place to build a sanctuary for him, a place that he could move into when he got released from prison. Jeffs demanded that the walls needed to be thick and high in order to prevent assassination attempts on his life. Dutifully, Jessup complied and secured a piece of ground, and within 60 days, folks, he went from a field to building a fortress, relying on the hands of hundreds of church laborers who worked free of charge around the clock. There was no concern for the expense of the building because it was for the profit. And quite frankly, the church had millions of dollars in reserve. Jeffs would be on the run until August of that year when he was found inside of a car, pulled over for a traffic violation just north of Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, this predator's luck had run out and he was again back in jail. It's odd to think that the fortress that Willie Jessup built was never seen by Warren Jeffs. Jeffs never slept there, never had any of his wives sleep there, and yet it's reported far and wide that it was his personal residence. It's almost comical that Willie Jessup found a way to take the compound from the Jeffs estate, now using it for a bed and breakfast. He fittingly named it the Zion Most Wanted Hotel in honor of the criminal Warren Jeffs. Now, listen to a few of Willie Jessup's comments about this fortress that he built for Jeffs.
Well, the walls are pure concrete, or white, all the way inside. It's got more steel in it than anything you can imagine. You could hit them with a full load of dump truck and hardly crack them. The panels are steel with lining to keep it from being, so we could protect him from assassinations and that kind of stuff. You'd have to go to get to his house. You'd have to come from through this wall, through that wall, to even get to the house.
It was the last thing that Willie Jessup would do for Warren Jeffs before he discovered that the horrors being claimed against Jeffs were true. Now, let's get back to that ever-tumbling FLDS House of Cards. In April of 2008, Texas law enforcement officers raided the Yearning for Zion Ranch after they discovered that Jeffs had been raping children inside its boundaries. This was yet another painful raid where hundreds of children were taken from their parents' arms. In total, 439 children were taken into protective custody, and only after a number of difficult court battles were Texas officials ordered to return the children. History had repeated itself in the FLDS community. Now, I don't blame the police or family service workers. I still believe the responsibility for this lies solely on the parents who allowed their children to be part of a closed society where their safety was in question. By November of 2008, 12 more FLDS men were charged with offenses relating to underage marriages conducted at the Yearning for Zion Ranch. The maximum sentence dealt was for 75 years behind bars. Now, Jeffs was convicted for life. 2 years later, Arizona officials executed search warrants at the government offices of the town of Colorado City, Arizona, and Hildale, Utah. According to one report, the warrants involved the misuse of funds and caused Hildale Police Department to be shut down. In November of 2012, the Texas Attorney General's office successfully seized the FLDS Ranch property in Texas. By June of 2014, the police force in Hildale and Colorado City was disbanded, and a new office, the Colorado City Hildale Marshal's Office, was instituted. A friend of mine with a long history of law enforcement was recruited to bring justice to the community, and I'm going to share some of my conversation with him in my next segment. But so much has changed in this community since all of this happened. A former polygamist wife who left the cult became the mayor, and she just started her second term. The changes in the community are evident. The city manager of Hildale now is a retired police officer, not from the polygamist community, but from the state of Arizona. He has a history of knowledge in regard to crimes of the past. As I drove through the community a few days ago, I sensed some things that I hadn't sensed before. The most prevalent feeling I felt was a feeling of safety. It's something that I'm going to explain in the next episode, and I hope you'll return for that. And folks, if you like this episode, please take a moment and hit that like and subscribe button. And most importantly, share this with your friends and personal contacts. You can subscribe to Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And you can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you're one of those people who just can't get enough of crime stories, consider checking out our channel memberships where you get additional content. You can do it for as little as $1.99 a month. It really helps me out and it makes it possible for Profiling Evil to continue to provide quality content. And if you like to learn about the criminal profiling and investigative process, I hope you'll consider my new Profiling Evil Academy membership. It's my personal favorite. The link is down below and you can get in for $4.99 a month. You'll get special content ahead of anybody else, including some one-on-one discussions. So thanks again for your support as we look at the FLDS Church. I appreciate your support of Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.